everyone, and welcome to another members-only live stream. I am Marie Walker, the director of the Ada Mae Ivester Education Center here at the Northeast Georgia History Center, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the presidential palace, the executive mansion, the president's house, the people's house. That White House that sits at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. has been known by many names and gone through many changes over the past 200 years. It is arguably one of the most recognizable homes in the United States, but would you have recognized it in 1814? From its construction to now, this symbol of American democracy has faced many changes as different leaders have each left their mark. Today, we're going to explore how the White House came to be how we know it. In the floor of the White House's entrance hall, there are a series of dates inside a circle of stars. These dates are 1792, 1817, 1902, and 1952. They represent the four major construction and renovation projects that shaped the White House. But of course, every first family leaves their mark on the White House in one form or another. Some are just more permanent. George Washington, the first president of the United States, never lived in the executive mansion, but he still had an incredible influence on the building. It was Washington who, along with Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, the designer of the nation's capital, selected a site for the executive mansion in 1791. L'Enfant proposed what can only be described as a presidential palace. It was very grand and just very, very large. 5 times as large as what ended up being built. But that was not to be. Washington actually fired L'Enfant for insubordination, and it was decided by the commissioners of the newly formed D.C. to hold a national architectural competition to see who could come up with the best design for the Capitol and the president's house. There were many entries. Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the commissioners of D.C., submitted designs, but it was James Hoban who won the competition. Hoban had been born in Ireland, but then immigrated to the United States, and at the time of the competition was living in Charleston, South Carolina. He had modeled his prize-winning design after an Anglo-Irish villa in Dublin named Leinster House. It had originally been built in the 1740s for the residence of the Duke of Leinster, but in 1922, after Ireland got its independence, it became the building that houses Ireland's parliament. Hoban's design was done in the Palladian style, which was very popular in Europe at the time. Palladianism was a style of architecture that was very strongly influenced and inspired by the work of architect Andrea Palladio. Palladio is considered one of the most influential architects of all time. He designed countless churches and palaces during the Italian Renaissance in the 16th century. Palladio himself was very inspired by the architecture of the Greeks and the Romans. Therefore, the Palladian style is characterized by many classical forms that can be traced back to those ancient civilizations. Symmetry is a must, and there are very strict proportions to follow for rooms. So if you're ever thought that the White House looks a little bit like an ancient Greek temple, well, that's because it does. On October 13th, 1792, the construction for the White House began, with the official laying of the Cornerstone by George Washington during a Masonic ceremony. Now, it is no secret that Washington and also many other of the founding fathers and presidents since then have been Freemasons. And in this society, the cornerstone of a building symbolizes sturdiness, morality, and truth. It is very important to the character of the building, and it is traditionally placed in the northeast corner of the foundation. Construction then began on the White House, and that lasted for over 8 years. The construction team was made up of enslaved and freed African Americans as well as European immigrants. They used sandstone for the structure, which is a stone that varies in color from light gray to brown. It is very easy to find and easy to cut. The only drawback was that sandstone is rather susceptible to weather-related deterioration. Therefore, in 1798, it was decided that the structure should be given a lime-based whitewash to protect the exterior from moisture and particularly cracking that could occur during the winter freezes. This is when we see the term White House used for the first time, but it's just used occasionally. It appears in newspapers and periodicals throughout the 19th century, but most journalists, citizens, and visitors at this time refer to this place as the President's House or the Executive Mansion, and those would be the two most common names for it throughout the 1800s. On very early maps, it is referred to as the Presidential Palace, and that is what Abigail Adams also referred to the house as, but she did so more in a joking manner. The building was not quite done when John and Abigail Adams became the first presidential pair to move in on the 1st of November, 1800. Workmen had to rush to get the walls plastered in time, and, well, they got most of the rooms done, but not all. The East Room was still unfinished, and Abigail actually used it as a place to hang laundry. John Adams was initially very excited to get to live in this executive mansion, as it was the largest residential home in the United States at the time. And he had been living in a hotel while in D.C. up until that point. But after a few weeks, he and Abigail found the building not to be a pleasant place to live. Abigail is noted to have incessantly complained about how cold and damp the house was. She wrote to a friend saying that the building is tolerable only so long as fires are lit in every room. But Abigail did not have to tolerate the president's house for long. She only lived there 5 months before her husband lost the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, and then they moved back to Massachusetts. Thomas Jefferson moved into the executive mansion and saw things that he could improve upon immediately. Remember, he had submitted an architectural design during the original competition, and now this is his chance to add his own flair. The first thing that Jefferson did was knock down the wooden outhouse that was out back of this stately home and installed 2 water closets, early forms of toilets, in the upstairs on either end of the house. Jefferson also hired architect Benjamin Latrobe to add terraced pavilions on either end of the house that were to be used as domestic service wings. This would make the executive mansion more like the home Jefferson had designed for himself, Monticello, but they were only partially completed when he left office in 1809. The original version of the president's home only stood for 13 years and 8 months, though, before it was burned by British forces as they attacked Washington, D.C. on August 24, 1814. The fire gutted the president's home. Some of the exterior walls were left standing, but there was still smoke damage done to those walls. James Hoban, the original architect, was brought back in to rebuild it, and he was ordered to make it just like it was before. In some places, he attempted to incorporate parts of the older structure into the rebuilding process, but there really was not much left, at least on the inside. There was rather nothing. Some of the exterior walls were really all that was left there that he tried to incorporate. So this rebuilding was essentially from scratch, and it was completed in 1817. But Hoban was not done with the executive mansion. He was actually called back to D.C. in 1824 by President James Monroe to build the South Portico. This is one of the most iconic elements of the White House today, and one of my personal favorites. It has 6 ionic columns radiating from the oval room of the White House, and then it is flanked by 2 staircases that turn inward at the landing, drawing the eye back to center. And to one of my favorite features of this portico, which are these 3 Roman style arches done at the bottom. This is still very much done in the Palladian style. There is symmetry, exact proportions, and the use of classical Greek and Roman styles. I would argue that this is actually a little bit more Roman influence here, because this element is all about rounded features, which is more Roman, and because, well, the Romans figured out how to build circular arches. So I would argue that this element is perhaps more Roman than Greek. Now, in 1829, Hoban designed the North Portico for President Andrew Jackson, which was completed in 1830. The North Portico is unquestionably the most famous feature of the White House we know today, at least on the outside. When you think of the White House, you probably think of its front door. This is the view of the house from Pennsylvania Avenue. The North Portico was built not just because it looks cool, but to give an even grander entrance to the executive mansion. Well, you could say that, but really is for practical reasons. To give those arriving at the president's house by coach or horseback a place to dismount out of the weather. This would be Hoban's final contribution to the White House, as he died in 1831, a year after its completion. The president's house then did not have any major additions or renovations until 1902, when President Theodore Roosevelt decided the place needed some work and a new name. It was during Roosevelt's administration that the White House became the official name of the president's place of residence. Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive, not just in politics, but also in remodeling. The executive mansion was essentially the same building as it was in 1817, with a patchwork of updates, and Roosevelt wanted to give the place a modern makeover and make the old house fit for life in the 20th century. Roosevelt hired the famous architectural firm McKim, Mead & White. Charles McKim was personally in charge of the project that he called a restoration. The plans for the outside of the White House could arguably be called a restoration. There were no plans to alter the outside. By this time, the iconic face of the president's house was just, well, it was too iconic to touch. But the inside can be much more accurately described as a remodel. One of the most significant alterations was that the original grand staircase was removed, and the side staircase that was in the entrance hall was enhanced to become grander. The Roosevelts also needed more bedrooms. This was one of the largest families to live in the executive mansion, as the president and the first lady had 6 children that were all living with them in the White House, and they just needed more space. Therefore, McKim came up with the idea to move the executive offices for the presidency out of the second floor of the White House, where they had been since James Monroe's administration, and into a building of their own. This was seen as temporary, as the building was originally called the Temporary Executive Office. It was designed to be the office for the staff of the secretary to the president. The president himself, he had a workroom that was adjacent to the secretary's office. And then there was another adjacent room there for the meeting of the cabinet. But today, we know these temporary offices to be the West Wing of the White House. They stayed and have become a very permanent, iconic fixture of the White House we know today. But of course, the most famous room in the White House, in the West Wing, is still not in existence. President William Howard Taft expanded the West Wing in 1909 and built the Oval Office. This served as the president's office until 1929, when a fire actually destroyed it, and FDR then built the modern Oval Office in the corner of the West Wing that overlooks the Rose Garden, the Oval Office we know today, in 1934. So it's not even 100 years old, the Oval Office that we know. But by the time Truman took office in 1945, the White House was 128 years old. And it needed some major work done, not just a remodel of the inside because electricity is a thing, but the White House was actually structurally weak and in danger of collapsing. Some people said the White House was only standing out of force of habit. Now, the photos of the Truman renovation are somewhat shocking. The inside of the White House was gutted, just like it was in 1814. Scaffolding held the walls in place while a new foundation was poured, and then the floors were rebuilt. The service areas of the White House were transformed dramatically to serve a very thoroughly modern White House. People don't need a whole room dedicated to curing meat when you have a refrigerator. But the public rooms used for entertaining dignitaries from around the world and the private rooms used by the president's family were rebuilt generally following the original plan. There was also a balcony added to the South Portico, which is called the Truman Balcony. It is one of the few major changes on the exterior of the White House since, well, the addition of the porticos themselves. Since the Truman administration, not much has really changed with the structure of the White House, but of course the decoration on the inside, well, that is another story. I am now very happy to share with you interviews that we conducted with Dr. Matthew Costello, who is the senior historian at the White House Historical Association, as well as Dr. Danielle Wilkins, who is the assistant professor at the School of Architecture at Georgia Tech.
So my name is Dr. Matthew Costello. I'm Vice President of the David M. Rubenstein National Center for White House History and Senior Historian at the White House Historical Association.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Could you tell us a little bit about the White House Historical Association and how it came to be?
The White House Historical Association was founded in 1961 at the request of First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy as a cooperating association with the National Park Service. Ever since then, we've operated as a private, nonpartisan, non-political organization dedicated to helping the public understand the White House, acquire historic artifacts, and also contribute to a variety of different types of preservation and conservation programs.
And can you tell us a little bit about your role within it?
So in my role as senior historian, I oversee much of the historical content that the association is producing. This can be things like social media, so the content that you see on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. It can also be larger research initiatives, for example, like our Slavery in the President's Neighborhood Research Initiative, which we launched in 2020, but has been years in the making to research and identify the enslaved people and free African Americans who built and lived in and worked at the White House.
Yes, and can you tell us a little bit about the physical construction of the White House?
So the first iteration of the White House was constructed from 1792 to 1800. That, of course, is when John Adams moved in November 1st, 1800. The White House was mostly complete, but there was still a lot of work that needed to be done in the interior, but it was done enough for the President of the United States to move in. And during that 8 years, there were hundreds of laborers. Quite a few of them were enslaved Africans and African Americans. We also know that there were free African Americans, there were immigrant laborers, there were Scottish stonemasons, Irish workers, American contractors. It was a real mix of different types of labor that built the original White House between 1792 and 1800. Of course, the story that's interlinked with that is the laying of the Cornerstone, and that happened on October 13th, 1792. So one of the great mysteries of White House history has been what happened to the Cornerstone, because no one has been able to identify it or locate it. There are a number of theories as to what happened to the Cornerstone. One possibility is that someone came along and swiped it early on, perhaps even shortly after they laid down the brass plate and after the dedication ceremony. There's another possibility that perhaps over time that plate has disintegrated. There's another theory that perhaps the fire set by the British in 1814, that the heat caused it maybe to decompose. So we're not exactly sure, what exactly happened to it, but there's been all kinds of technology used to try to locate it. They've used sonar, they've used X-ray, they've used when they rebuilt the White House during the Truman renovation, they were relying on the expertise of the stonemasons to try to locate it. But unfortunately, it's just one of those things, one of the great mysteries of White House history that no one has been able to solve.
Good history mystery.
Yes.
Yeah. So can you talk to us a little bit about the different names that have been used for the White House over the years? There's been very many. So can you take us through some of those? And how did we arrive at calling the White House, well, the White House?
Yes. So early on, when the president's house was more sort of as a conception or a vision, Pierre Charles L'Enfant, his original plan, it was going to be more like a palace, a presidential palace. And ultimately, when they used James Hoban's design, they not only shrunk the house, they dropped it an entire story. So the version that you see today is actually sort of a reduced version of what the original president's house was. Early on, that's what most people referred to it as, the president's house. But over time, the name Executive Mansion started to be used more and more. And then, of course, there are newspaper accounts and recollections and things like that in the 19th century where people refer to it as the White House, because it was painted white. The first instance of putting a whitish substance came in 1798 when they used a lime-based whitewash to seal the sandstone that the White House was made out of. But really, the brighter white that we're more familiar with today, the first iteration of that actually took place in 1818 during the administration of James Monroe. Now they used something a little bit heavier that time, in part because to cover the scorch marks. The White House had been burnt by the British. Then it was reconstructed by architect James Hoban again between 1814 and 1817. And then from 1818 onward, they used lead-based white paint to coat the outside. And so, over time, people would still call it President's House. Then it became Executive Mansion, more oftenly used. And then finally, we see this turn towards the White House during the Theodore Roosevelt administration. And when you look at some of the letters that are coming out of the White House, it's, there was no official decree, there was no executive order or anything like that. There's a request that comes from George Bruce Cortelyou, who's the private secretary to Theodore Roosevelt. And he sends a letter to Secretary of State John Hay requesting that all future communications that are sent to the White House that require the president's signature now have the White House at the top of the heading. So that directive actually comes out through Theodore Roosevelt, through his secretaries, and then on to the heads of the different executive branch departments. And then eventually, official stationery is created. And then from that point forward, the White House is used in all official documentation. And then popular culture and newspapers, things like that follow suit. And so really pretty consistently since the Theodore Roosevelt administration, it's been known as the White House.
Very interesting. Are we sure of why Theodore Roosevelt and his staff decided to switch it up and call it the White House rather than the President's House?
Well, there are a couple of theories. One of the theories is that across the country there are executive mansions, and those are the mansions that belong to governors. And Theodore Roosevelt himself was a former governor of New York, so he had lived in an executive mansion himself, and that he thought that this distinct building should have a different designation than, say, an executive mansion in New York, Virginia, wherever. Another theory is that that name was becoming more popularized, and so to make the switch from executive mansion to the White House, it made sense because that was sort of the popular usage anyway, right? More and more people, the press, people were using the White House, so it just made more sense to move to that particular designation. My own belief is that Roosevelt probably believed that it needed a special designation. And I theorized in some of my own research that he specifically waits. I mean, this would be a big deal otherwise, right? But keep in mind, what brings Roosevelt to the presidency is the assassination of William McKinley. And McKinley dies in September 1901. And of course, there are the 30 days of mourning, right? And so when you look at the timing of the letter, when that letter for the directive goes to Secretary of State, hey, it's right after the 30 days of mourning are over. And so I think to me, that suggests that Roosevelt and his staff were being very careful about when to change that official designation. They didn't want to appear to be disrespectful to William McKinley, or to show that they hadn't considered the wider implications of changing the name. In fact, you can find quite a bit of the mourning stationery. So this would have been paper that's typically outlined in black, and it would have had black print for the executive mansion, for the date. And from that point forward, I mean, I think it was a transition point, going from McKinley to Roosevelt, but then also, no longer using that mourning stationery, the 30 days are up. And so, repositioning and changing the stationery also suggests that Roosevelt was thinking more, I think, long-term about what the home of the president should be called.
Very interesting. And Roosevelt himself changed up the White House a lot. One of the big renovations that happened in the White House happened in 1902. So with the temporary West Wing, or
the temporary executive office, yes, which hasn't been very temporary, as it turns out.
Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think a lot of people usually think of the White House, they think of the Oval Office, but the Oval Office has not always been there. So can you talk to us about the creation of that iconic Oval Office?
Of course. So with the Roosevelt renovation in 1902, you have to keep a few things in mind. First, the second floor of the White House, today we know it as the private quarters, but prior to Theodore Roosevelt, that floor was actually divided in half, and the west end was the private quarters for the family, and the east end was actually where the president worked, and the president's secretaries and clerks and messengers. And then when you had visitors or office seekers, this is where we see some of these great old lithographs and drawings and sketches of people being lined up to go upstairs to see the president. Now, over time, as the president's staff expands, to meet the demands of the job, the presidency is becoming a bigger and bigger job. The government is growing. They need more workspace, and then the timing with that, the Roosevelts move in and they have a large family. So space is really it's a quantity that is in dire demand, and so what Roosevelt does is he suggests building a separate office space, a separate designated presidential workspace, and he builds what is called then the temporary executive office building, which then became later known as the West Wing. And in order to do it, they had to demolish the White House Conservatory, which was on the west side of the house, and then a series of greenhouses that were being used to grow all different types of flowers that were used for various White House events. So today, all the flowers are brought to the White House. A lot of them are grown off-site. Quite a few in National Park Service greenhouses elsewhere, and the flowers are transported. But prior to that, they grew all the flowers on the grounds, and that was what they used. And so Roosevelt has these greenhouses and the conservatory demolished, and he adds what is the first executive office. And almost immediately, it's filled to capacity. The presidency continues to grow and expand. And so it's going to be his immediate successor, William Howard Taft, who builds the first iteration of the Oval Office. So even though Roosevelt is credited for building the West Wing, his version of the West Wing doesn't actually have an Oval Office. It's William Howard Taft who builds the first one in 1909. Then the next major renovation of the space is in 1934 during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. He expands it, not only adding a second level and excavating a lower level sub-basement of offices, but he also moves the Oval Office to its present day location, which is in the southeast corner of the West Wing. So when Taft built his, it was more in the middle and to the south, and Roosevelt moves it more to the southeast in 1934.
All right. And now a burning question. Why is it oval?
That's an excellent question. Again, one of those great mysteries of White House history. But there are a few theories. The first one is that you can really trace the history of the Oval Office back to the original Oval Saloon, elliptical saloon. Today we know it as the Blue Room. But there was an oval-shaped room from the first iteration of the White House that was built by James Hoban between 1799 and 1800. Now, even though he never lived in the house, President George Washington, like everything else, he was a meticulous micromanager. He weighed in, and really, even though it wasn't going to be his house, it was a house that he thought a president of the United States should live in. And so when we look at Washington's time as president, he lived in several presidential residences in New York, but most of his time in Philadelphia. And in the house that he rented in Philadelphia, which you could still visit today, there are portions of it, sort of like a pseudo reconstruction of the space right by Independence Hall in Philadelphia. He had the back of two of the rooms turned with bow-shaped windows. And why bow-shaped windows? Because this was really the ideal space to do what was called a levee. These would have been, by invitation. Gentlemen would have been asked to come in well-dressed clothes. They would have come in. They would have greeted the president. They would have stood in that semicircular fashion, and then an aide would have introduced the president to these individuals. He would have, expressed some sentiments, moved on, and then they would have been dismissed. It was a holdover tradition that came, quite a few of the noble courts of Europe were doing this. It was some labeled it as aristocratic, that what maybe perhaps Washington wanted to be king. But I think what Washington wanted was people to respect the presidency. It was a new office. We had never had a president before, not like this. And Washington saw it as basically everything that he did was going to set a precedent. And so it was really important that people respect the executive branch. They respect the person that resides in the executive branch. And so he instituted a lot of these things, thinking more about the power and the prestige that the presidency should project. And as a result, he brought those ideas with him to when it came to constructing a president's house that he would never live in. Now, James Hoban was trained in Europe. He would have been very familiar with oval-shaped rooms. In fact, there's a building in Dublin, the Newcomen Bank, that some historians have argued that Hoban was working with Irish architect Thomas Ivory. So he would have been familiar with this idea of an oval-shaped room being more of the salon for greeting guests. It would have been probably your more formal parlor. And certainly for a head of state, you would have wanted a space like that. So then we fast forward to 1909, and when William Howard Taft wants to design a new president's house, his architect, Nathan Wyeth, who looks for the inspiration for this, and he sees it as the Blue Room in the White House. I mean, it is the most famous of the spaces in the White House. It is the most formal. So why not take those ideas and put them into the West Wing?
That's very interesting. Just the whole history behind it. It's just such an iconic piece of, the White House / West Wing.
Right.
So you mentioned that part of the historical association that you're a part of acquires things for the White House. So is there a more recent thing that you're very excited about the White House having acquired, or a favorite artifact within the White House that you really enjoy the story behind?
Ooh, that's a great question. So yeah, maybe I'll start maybe a little bit more broad, and then I'll zoom in.
All right.
So the association has been around since 1961, and as part of our mission, we seek to not only educate the public, but also help the White House acquire historic artifacts that maybe perhaps at one point were used in the White House or were purchased for the White House, and to restore them, to conserve them, and make them part of the permanent White House collection. Now, today, the White House collection consists of more than 60,000 items. Keep in mind, though, that when we say 60,000 items, we're counting one knife as a knife, and one fork, that's 2 things, and one glass, that's 3 things. So as you can imagine, quite a bit of the collection is, things like glassware, flatware, china, silverware. But anytime these types of things come up, we are consulted about acquiring them and then donating them to the permanent collection. Most recently, we finished a 10-year project to restore, reupholster, and regild the furniture in the Blue Room. So the original furniture was ordered by President James Monroe in 1817. It consisted of 53 pieces, and it was created by a French cabinet maker named Pierre-Antoine Boulanger. So when you hear of the Boulanger furniture, it's named after him. And these 53 pieces arrived in late 1817, and they were just in time for the New Year's reception that James Monroe hosted in 1818. This would have been the most elegant furniture in the house by far. It was French made, and it was very impressive. Monroe believed that, again, very similar to Washington, that the office of the presidency needed to project power and prestige. And one way to do that was through furnishings. And he wanted people to be impressed. In particular, he wanted, anytime they had foreign visitors or, visiting dignitaries, ministers, he wanted them to also be impressed with the things that an American president would have. Now, you go forward to 1860, and we know in 1860 there was a public auction, and James Buchanan, who was president of the United States at that time, his niece Harriet Lane, she was really the first lady of her time. She was the hostess of the White House, and they had organized a public auction to get rid of quite a few White House furnishings. And we know that what remained of the Boulanger suite was sold at auction in 1860. Now, ever since then, there's been different attempts to try to identify and bring things back, but this really picked up speed during the Kennedy administration, when First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy found the only piece of Boulanger that had evaded the public auction, and it's the gilded table with the mirror in it that you'll see today if you go to the White House and you look in the entrance hall. It's there in the entrance hall next to the usher's office. She had found that original piece. She wanted to know where the rest of them were. And this is what sparked trying to figure out where some of these pieces have gone, and also bringing some of the original pieces back. And so we started a more than a decade-long project with the Office of the Curator and the Committee for the Preservation of the White House to restore and reupholster and regild the 10 original pieces that have been brought back to the collection. And so if you go to the White House today or in the near future, what you'll see are the new Boulanger pieces that have been restored and regilded. And I mean, it's incredible because, over time they had just kept gilding and gilding and gilding. So then of course the chairs, they just got like thicker and thicker, and you couldn't see the fine details and the carvings in the chair. And the same thing even with the fabrics and the designs, picking something that would have been, picking a design that would have been, not only available in 1817, but also, would have been French made, would have been in line maybe with Monroe's other tastes, to make it as period appropriate and as accurate as we can based on the surviving documentation. So that was a more than 10-year project, but, I think the work really speaks for itself. And one of the great discoveries with that project was in the original 53-piece suite, there were 2 fire screens. And we thought that these were lost to history. And one turned up in somebody's, I think it was a barn or a garage. It was one, and it was in such poor condition that I think nobody would have thought that that was a piece of Boulanger furniture. But, when it came to the attention of the Office of the Curator and us, they could identify it. And so it just goes to show you, like, there's still these incredible pieces of history out there. And so our job is to help find those, to fund the conservation of those pieces, and then to bring them back to the White House where they belong.
Oh, that's amazing. So would you say most of the furniture in the White House now has a history with the house?
Yeah, I would, at this point in time, I would say definitely so. If you would have asked maybe in like the 1960s, probably not. And a big part of that was, there wasn't even an Office of the Curator until 1961. So The responsibilities for overseeing the furnishings of the White House, it sort of varied between different governmental offices. For a while, it was with the Commissioner of Public Buildings, and then really from 1867 forward, then it was with the Army Corps of Engineers. The National Park Service then gets involved later in the 1930s. And then really until 1961, when you actually have a designated curator on site. I mean, there still isn't really anybody who's professionally trained to handle objects, to bring objects in, to move things, to catalog things. And so since the 1960s forward, what we've seen is an incredible return of items, not only just finding things that come up at auction, but also, items that perhaps, presidential families want to give back to the White House, or, descendants from one way or another, maybe their great-great-grandfather worked at the White House and, President Grant gave them this thing and, we can document it, that can come back. So, I mean, it's pretty incredible. It's one of those ways that you can really connect people more with the White House. And oftentimes it's through their own families, because that's where these stories come from and that's where these objects come from.
Oh, that's amazing. Is there anything you wish I would have asked you, or final thoughts that you would like to share?
One of the things I always like to share with people, because it seems like we go through this every administration, and people, if a president or a first lady decides, that they want to put a piece of art somewhere, or they want to move portraits, don't be alarmed. This happens all the time. This happens with every administration. The White House is a place of continuity and change. And when I say that, I mean that there are a number of things that a new administration will continue doing, just like the previous administration, and just like the administration before that, just like the administration before that. And there are also a number of things that a new administration will do differently, because they want to do those things their own way. And sometimes that involves, changes to the White House. And so, so often people, they can get very fixated on the idea of, changing things, moving things. They get to the level where they think it's almost sacrilegious. And, this is a home. So, it would be like one homeowner moves out, a new homeowner moves in. Chances are you're probably not going to keep everything in the same exact place as the previous person. You're probably going to put in your own art. You're probably going to move things. So, to keep in mind that, yes, it is the White House represents the presidency. It represents the office of the presidency, but it's also a home. And so I would say on the state floor, not much changes. That is a very public space. That's the space that people walk through for tours. There's actually a lot of change that happens in the private quarters, and that's upstairs on the second and third floors. But that is because that is the private residence of the president and the first lady of the United States. Now that's also closed to the public, so people don't see those changes. But for most of its history, it's constantly been changed.
I think that's a fantastic final note to end on. Thank you so much for being with us today. This has been fantastic.
Thank you for having me.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. My name is Danielle Wilkins, and I'm an architectural historian and an architectural designer. I'm an assistant professor at Georgia Tech, and I teach architectural history classes, as well as design studios and seminars, and really enjoy working with digital technologies. So get to play with some pretty cool pieces of equipment.
Nice, nice. Can you tell us a little bit about how the White House was designed, the architectural styles, and what went into that?
Sure. So the White House is actually a really interesting kind of formation to the United States as someone on the architectural map. So you figure we're kind of trying to figure out what our identity is as a country. The built environment is a great way to establish that. So they actually have a competition for the White House, and there were 7 participants who entered. Thomas Jefferson happened to be one of them. He did not have the winning design. Washington is who selected the winning design, and it came to be that it was actually an architect from Ireland. And I say architect in the sense that he was trained as a builder and had worked previously in Ireland, but we didn't really have the same kind of formal architecture schools as we do today, and he wasn't formally trained. But Hoban, James Hoban, who's the one who won, came over and was fortunate to be in the country a few years before that competition in 1792 and selected the winner. He got the building commission. He got $500, which at that time was a pretty good amount of money. And as I said, it's really kind of establishing what Washington is going to be as a city. It's really swampy. It's not really the greatest of locations. The capital had been in different areas, discussions about Philadelphia and New York. And so being in Washington, D.C. was a little bit of an odd choice for some. And so establishing this really amazing architecture was a huge part of establishing the city. So they're drawing on precedents from ancient Rome and ancient Greece and this idea that we'll have this democratic republic. So that's why you see the architecture that you do in central DC today. In some ways, it's very much architecture that's looking towards what they hope the government will be. It takes quite a while to get there, though. So it takes a long time to build. Materials are hard to get a hold of. We don't really have the trained builders in the country for that scale of labor. And so there's a lot of immigrants who are working on the building, and a lot of those who are actually enslaved who are working on what was called at that time the President's House or the Executive Mansion. In
your opinion, how do you think James Hoban really came up with that design, or how, those drawing on the Greek and Roman classic architecture? Can you tell us a little bit more about what particulars got transferred over?
Sure. So Hoban is really looking at, he's from rural parts of Ireland, grew up in Kilkenny, I believe, and County Kilkenny, and does spend some time in Dublin, but is a little bit more familiar with the rural landscape. And so what he's drawing on, which is actually very popular at the time, if we look at the UK, is the work of Andrea Palladio, who is a 16th century Italian architect. He was a stone cutter turned architect who worked in the Veneto, so right around Venice. And he would become famous for designing the residences of sort of the Venetian elite. So these villas and palazzos, so things that were in the country and things that were in the city. And those villas were working farms. So those became a model for a lot of the country houses that we see in the UK and in Ireland, and then are also translated into the plantation landscape as we look towards the Americas and the islands as well. And so that plantation landscape, Monticello is a really good example of that, a centralized home and these sort of flanking wings, which were part of the working farm. And in many ways, that's the kind of inspiration that Hoban is taking. It's very much a Palladian plan that he's looking at. And I think that might have been also quite reflective of the aspirations of people like Washington. You figure he was a farmer and a surveyor. Washington, and he shared this with then at the time Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, thought that the United States was going to be an agrarian nation. That was going to be our prime kind of identity. So it makes sense that those would be the kind of references that they'd be drawing upon. But it's embellished, right? So there's columns, there's pilasters, there's decorative elements. So part of it was showing, yes, there is this kind of agrarian tie, but at the same time, it's a refined aesthetic to the building.
So would you say that the White House really influenced American architecture going past that, and how, if it did?
Sure. I mean, I think just the fact that the federal government was sponsoring architectural projects and doing it pretty rapidly in Washington says something. Between the Capitol building, a number of the executive offices, it became really kind of the premier aspect of American architecture. There's a really spectacular book on Robert Mills, who is in some ways considered America's first architect as a native born. So he wasn't immigrating from somewhere else, but he was born in the US. And Robert Mills is the person who designed the Washington Monument and a number of other structures that we recognize. But Mills worked in Hoban's office. And so for a lot of the designers who would then go on to influence the later portions of the 1800s and even into the early 20th century, there's this amazing lineage of who was working within those offices of DC and getting to work kind of under the patronage of the federal government. And I think in some ways it also spurs then our state governments to invest in architecture in ways maybe they wouldn't have otherwise, because the states wanted to compete and then have this architecture that would draw people and make them feel, quite proud of their Capitol building. And that it was reflective of the fact that, again, America was not just this sort of barren agrarian place, but somewhere that was refined, that would, hopefully come to be some sort of, real force in the world as a very young country.
Yeah, for sure. That I'm thinking about, our state capital in Georgia and how it very much seems like you can see the direct influence from that to the capital in DC and a lot of that kind of Greek and Rome ideas of democracy.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think that speaks to, and a little bit earlier, we kind of have to throw Jefferson in there as well as the architect, and there's some argument behind this that there was another architect that he worked with who was French and antiquarian or so, but he was working on the Virginia state capitol in the late 1780s. So that was influential as well. So it's that kind of flavor of the Democratic Republic and drawing on those roots of Greece and Rome were definitely in, we would say, sort of the water already by the time we get to Washington in the early 1790s. But it speaks to how the rest of our capitals are formed, that we do see, domes and symmetrical layouts and columns. Off the top of my head, I can't picture like a neo-Gothic capital in the US. And so it does definitely set sort of a tenor for what the architecture is going to look like in the United States. And it's also under they would start to call it a little bit later on, like the Federalist style, which I always sort of joke around and say is basically neoclassical architecture with an eagle. So basically some way of like imposing like American iconography onto neoclassical architecture. So that's a really easy, if you see an eagle on it, it's a federal building. So that's easy to identify.
So earlier you mentioned a Palladian plan. Is that referring to a floor plan? And can you walk us through that floor plan?
Sure. So right, a plan, and I would say that's where, architecture has this amazing graphic language that's attached to it. A plan is essentially if we could slice a building horizontally and look down. And plans have been around since, the ancient Egyptians. It's a way of kind of conveying information, and it's really handy that we can pick up a plan from another language and understand it or another time. But the plans for Palladian villas tended to be based on this idea of like harmonic proportions. And so that there's a relationship between each of the rooms, which unfortunately is something we probably don't design with enough today, and maybe explains why some of our new federal buildings are not the easiest to navigate. But it was often the concept of a centralized entry, and then these flanking rooms. There could be asymmetry within that, but there was sort of an overall sense of organization within the space, and one that was fairly kind of easy to understand once you entered. It wasn't a maze in any sense. It was very much linear organizations. and kind of proportions that were based on volumes and being able to see from one space into another space. And then having this larger connection with the landscape, which I think is something also really critical to how we look at something like the White House in the landscape of Washington, D.C. That is part of this overriding landscape plan that's tied to another immigrant, right? Tied to Pierre L'Enfant, who is proposing this gridded and axial layout of Washington, which is very much influenced by Parisian design. So our capital has these flavors of all these other places to it, which I think is really fascinating. And it's hard to really divorce like the building from its site. And that would be very true for a Palladian plan as well, as they were part of the farm. So that building didn't live in isolation.
That was really an interesting take on it too, is just, not just the architecture of the actual building, but the whole plan of the city and how it was important to choose the specific site for the White House. Are you familiar with how they chose the site for the White House?
I don't know the nuances of that particular one, but I know it's one of the focal points within the layout. So when we look at it, the Capitol is on one end. Eventually it would be anchored by the Lincoln Memorial in the center. It's essentially a cross in the center of that. And we would call basically like the transept of a church plan. If we look at that, is the Washington Monument. To the north of that is the White House. To the south of that is the Jefferson Memorial. So it makes DC really easy to navigate in some ways, because you can always, if you can catch one of those landmarks, you know where you are in the city. But DC was also, as I said, it was a swampland. So it wasn't the easiest place to build. It was hard to get materials to the site. For anybody who's interested, there's David McCullough did a book about John Adams, and they turned that into a series, a mini series that's done really well. And one of the scenes shows the Adamses arriving to the White House. Well, at that time would have been known as the President's house, arriving, and it's unfinished. They have these fires going to try to cure the plaster walls. It is definitely not any type of kind of glamorous reception. It shows the city is muddy and just construction everywhere. And you figure that is what DC was like for a huge portion of its early foundations. And then just as things are kind of getting finished, it's the War of 1812, and the President's house is severely damaged during the War of 1812. So it's not used as a residence again until 1817. It's a White House that we see in sort of the early 20th century is the one that we would more recognize, because that's when there's some major renovations by a very famous American architectural firm named Mckinley and White, who come in and add what Hoban had intended, but those porticos or porches had never been finished. So those come in the early 1900s. And there's some obviously other changes that happen as other administrations come in and start to put really their fingerprint on the house. Things like, pools get added, landscape features. And then there's some structural things that come into play too. Just after World War II, they really discovered that the building is in pretty bad shape structurally. And they go in and replace a lot of the wooden members with concrete and steel. So it's very much a living building, which I think is really fascinating. It's constantly been added onto and adapted, and certainly faced some turmoil during its lifetime. And it's declared a museum under the Kennedy administration. But I think, we often get caught up in these terms of like what a museum is. We have to remember, like, it's very much it's a living house, right? It's occupied. There are security concerns now that wouldn't have been in play in, when it was originally constructed, or even in the early part of the 20th century, that inform how the home works differently. I think it's a really fascinating structure in that it's been able to adapt to all these different changes over time. I think Jackie Kennedy's impact, so not even talking about the president, but talking about the first lady. And in some ways, the first ladies have played perhaps a bigger role in shaping the president's house because they're probably in it more often. And if we look to sort of traditional roles of what the first lady was doing, they were certainly the one who was managing the house. Those roles have obviously changed for good in recent years, but I think those fingerprints are really important to understand how things evolved and to better the public even having an interface with the president's house is like a fairly new concept. So in its early days, it would have been a reception space. It would have been, for kind of lack of a better term, like a party space in Washington, D.C., because there really wasn't much there. But then as it evolved, the idea that we could actually go and take a tour of the executive residence, if we look at other countries, that's a really unique thing. And so I think that aspect of being able to understand the history of that site and its meaning as kind of a house of the citizens, I think is really important.
Do you have a favorite architectural feature of the White House?
I it's just such the iconic shot, but I love the curved portico. It's just a really nice, and maybe we've seen it too much with like things like the West Wing and popular culture. It's such an iconic image. But I really do like how it's situated within the landscape. That it isn't this kind of barricaded site that's sort of hidden away, but it's right there in the core of the tourist area of Washington D.C. and also the working area of Washington D.C. from people who are in different federal offices. I worked in an architecture office 2 blocks north of the White House. And would say I definitely got annoyed anytime the motorcades came by because they shut our street down. but the fact that it's right down kind of in the center of the city, I think is really spectacular, and that it's accessible to be able to kind of interact with that building in different ways. So I would say that's one of my favorite features is maybe its visibility.
Oh, that's really cool. Now, is there anything that you wish that I had asked you that you wanted to talk about that you haven't gotten to talk about yet?
No, I think we went through a pretty good amount in a short time. So yeah, I don't have anything else essential, I think, to add.
Oh, well, this has been great. Thank you so much for meeting with me today.
Sure.
This has been wonderful and enlightening.
Excellent. Good. Well, yeah, I hope it's helpful. So
Absolutely.
Thank you so much to Dr. Matthew Costello and Dr. Danielle Wilkins for talking with us. Those were incredibly insightful and interesting interviews. I personally learned a lot, and I hope you did as well. The history of the White House, it's the people's house. It's kind of our house too, if you will. It's one of the few houses, private residences really, of heads of states that people are allowed to walk into around the world, and that is an amazing thing, really, that we as, ordinary citizens can go into, our leader's house and look around. I myself got to do that on an 8th grade field trip, and I got to see President Obama's dog. It was great. My claim to fame. But anyway, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you get a chance to visit the White House yourself. And until next time, stay safe and take care.